Hi everyone, this lecture we will be talking about Plato's The Allegory of the Cave. And so the Allegory of the Cave is from Plato's famous The Republic and provides a powerful image of the philosopher's journey and what we do when we do philosophy. So things that I want you to keep in mind throughout this lecture is the setting of the story, how the story begins, what happens to the prisoner once he's freed, and then what happens to the prisoner when he returns to deliver news to his fellow prisoners. And so this myth describes the philosopher's climb from the dark cave into the light, into an understanding of knowledge. And it's through this philosophical ignorance and up into the light that we see ourselves when we're doing philosophy. And so the story really begins with a bunch of chained prisoners watching shadows cast on a cave wall in front of them. And so the prisoners are facing the wall, facing the shadows that are being cast by the fire. And this is all the prisoners know. They're not able to turn their heads. They're not able to see each other. They can only speak to one another. And when they speak to one another, all they're seeing are these shadows. And so for them, reality is the shadows. The world is primarily two-dimensional and without detail. One day, one of the prisoners is freed from the chains and is able to climb over the wall and see what the shadows really are, and that they're just reflections of the images being cast on the wall by the fire. And so the prisoner climbs from out of the cave and is blinded by the light once he reaches the outside. This is supposed to be a metaphor for our understanding of the world when discovering new truths. For instance, when we learn that a bear is not that cuddly, soft, button-nosed teddy bear that we are given in our first few years of life to snuggle with, once we realize what a bear actually is, then we become more knowledgeable of not only what a bear is, but our life before knowing what that bear was or is. We start to understand our ignorance of thinking that the bear is just this cotton stuffed animal, this cuddly soft thing that can't hurt us. We see how this is just a representation of what is in real life an actual bear. And so our prisoner, once leaving the cave, is able to see clearly the world around him. After adjusting to the sun, he's able to recognize that he lives in a three-dimensional world where details are far more exquisite than the mere shadows on the cave wall. And with this newfound knowledge, the prisoner comes back down to the cave to tell his fellow prisoners what he's learned of. And so the prisoner comes back down into the cave, but once coming into the cave, he's temporarily blinded again by the darkness. We can imagine this if you're ever in a room and you flip off the lights, it takes a little while for your eyes to adjust to the darkness. And this is what the prisoner goes through upon re-entering the cave. And not only does the prisoner have to adjust to the darkness, but those shadows that he once took as reality, now he doesn't see them the same way anymore. He doesn't see the shadows in that realistic way he once did. Instead, he knows what the shadows are and how the shadows come about. Just like when you're to see a bear in real life or in a movie, and then look at that stuffed animal again, that stuffed animal just doesn't have that same appearance as it once did. And so the prisoner, excited to get back and tell his fellow prisoners what he sees, makes it back down. And once he begins to start to tell the prisoners what he's seen, they dismiss him as being crazy. For all they know, he's talking about this world that they've never experienced, that they've never seen, that they have no reason to believe. His ramblings make absolutely no sense. And while the original freed prisoner thought that he was going to be a hero coming back down and explaining the truth of the world to his fellow prisoners, he's met with discomfort and animosity of what he's talking about when he speaks about the true world. Now, looking back, if the prisoner is freed and forced to see the fire and the objects, he will have difficulty in seeing and will think the shadows are more real than the object. So, when our prisoner is first able to turn around and see the fire, remember, his whole life was looking at the shadows. So, anything that comes about now isn't as ingrained in his mind as the shadows that he knows. And so, when doing philosophy, when thinking critically about topics, we find that it's often very difficult to accept new truths. It's difficult to accept things different than how we once thought they were. And then the prisoner is blinded again by the sunlight when he leaves the cave. Seeing the truth is difficult. It's often painful sometimes. But once you're able to see the truth, going back to ignorance is almost impossible. And so when he returns to the cave, he would be unable to see and appreciate the shadows for what he once did, for what the prisoners see now. And because he would be unappreciative of what they're seeing, they wouldn't be able to connect with him, and he wouldn't be able to connect with them. The chained prisoners would simply laugh at him. And so this myth represents how we do philosophy and what it means to do philosophy. Philosophy is not some outcome. It's not about the end result. It's about the activity. It's about critically analyzing. It's about being open-minded. It's about being resilient. Philosophy is very hard, and often when we are doing philosophy, we discover things that we may not want to accept. It's difficult to accept truths sometimes. But as Bertrand Russell said, and we've talked about, it's the freeingness of this activity that allows us to release the burden from our shoulders of holding on to a misunderstanding of the world. Philosophy examines our most basic, most fundamental assumptions about the world, questions and demands of us that through our analytic and critical thinking, that we're able to go on this journey and discover the world. Plato reminds us that this pursuit involves our most basic and fundamental assumptions. And we're going to be talking about a lot of those in this class. We're going to talk about the existence of God. We're going to talk about what truly exists in the world. And how can we even know when we've reached the truth? And so there are a few questions that this allegory brings to light. First, how do we know that the world we're experiencing is not the world of shadows? How do we know that the world we're in right now is the true world? What makes us so sure that we're not living in the world of, let's say, The Matrix or Inception? And how would we know that our world is in fact the world we are experiencing? It doesn't seem so easy that we could just take a pill and wake up in the true world. And in addition, how do we even communicate the things we know to those who don't? In many instances, it's not necessarily knowing about the truth or knowing about the world, but explaining that truth and reasoning to the world around us, getting others to see what it is that we see. And so when we look at metaphysics in this class, we're going to be looking at what we refer to as first principles of existing, or first principles of being. What does it mean to have free will? What is justice? What is the mind? Do these things even exist? And how can we explain them to someone or even know for ourselves whether or not they do? Metaphysics asks the question of what it means to exist. And through this pursuit, we're going to use the Socratic method. And the Socratic method is essentially a method of questioning and answering, a back and forth between yourself, between your peers, to which we will make an assertion and then attack that assertion. And if we're able to attack that assertion, then we could maybe perhaps revise the assertion so that it makes more sense, and then we'll attack that. And then we can revise and attack, revise and attack. This is the Socratic method. And this method is expressed in the following video. So I ask you to watch the video. And this is another one of Plato's famous dialogues called Euthyphro, where Euthyphro, a contemporary of Socrates, is trying to explain to Socrates what it means to be pious. and what is piety. And you'll see through the video that Socrates is simply asking questions and trying to get clarification about what this idea is. This is what we need to be doing in this class. This is what we need to be doing in our lives. We need to take on the role of Socrates. Demand clarification. Try to understand what these ideas and concepts really mean and represent. And in trying to do that, we're going to need to know what our criteria is for even understanding whether or not we get to a right answer. This is the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which is the study of the nature of knowledge. We ask ourselves, how do we even know we're not in the cave? What makes us think that the world that we're living in now is not the cave? We once thought that the earth was the center of the universe, and we were mistaken. We once thought that the earth was flat. How are we so sure that what we know now is in fact the truth? So throughout this journey, we will be having to use the tools of logic and critical thinking. We're going to have to require good argumentation to express the answers to our metaphysical and epistemological questions. Because logic is our most basic source of deducing information. And so we will be talking about logic and how rational, analytical the arguments made about certain first principles are, or our ability to know the truth.